What is up, YouTube? And welcome to another video. Now, for those of you who work a lot on Kubernetes clusters, whether you're a developer, whether you're a DevOps engineer and you do CI/CD pipelines, you want to test some like security RBAC stuff, whether you want to do machine learning, whatever it is that you're running on top of Kubernetes, a lot of the times you need a cluster up and running quickly. Then you want to do some testing and you want to spin it down and create a new cluster. Now, on Linux, Windows, and Mac OS, there's a lot of like hypervisor-based like VMs that you can deploy, like Minikube, for example, where you can deploy a cluster using a hypervisor. Now, this is quite heavyweight in my opinion, and it's not that great of a solution. A lot of the times I want like 3 or 4 clusters up and running, and I want to delete them within like a few minutes of testing and create new ones. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys a technology called Kubernetes Kind, where we can literally spin up clusters in seconds. So without further ado, let's go. So what are some of the use cases for Kubernetes Kind? One of the bigger use cases is being able to test features in isolation without affecting your development or production environment. You can spin up a Kind cluster, you can test a bunch of things and then tear it down. The other thing is testing different versions of, let's say, like monitoring or CI/CD components. If you want to test the upgrade and maintenance process, so let's say a new version of Kubernetes comes out, you can create it using a Kind cluster, and you can kind of test out some of the initial upgrading steps to make sure things like your Prometheus operator, let's say your monitoring system, cluster monitoring, to make sure it still works on a new version of Kubernetes. So this is something I find Kind really useful, to test cluster upgrades, test software upgrades, versions of specific software and patching. So Kind is a tool for running Kubernetes clusters using Docker containers as nodes. So this is what makes it really powerful and really fast to provision. So firstly, we got to know what the kubelet is. Now, every node that runs within Kubernetes has the kubelet installed. The kubelet is like the heart of what makes a Kubernetes node join a cluster. Now, if you're running a kubelet on your cell phone, or you're running it in the cloud, or you're running it on-prem, it doesn't really matter. The kubelet is kind of like just a virtual instance, a bit of software that can run either on physical or virtual machines. And once that kubelet is up and running, it can join a cluster. So when Kubernetes was still new, to spin up a kubelet was quite a lot of work. You had to bootstrap all the processes, put the configuration files and edit them, and run a bunch of services on a machine in order to bootstrap a cluster. Now it's become a lot easier. So all the components of Kubernetes have slowly become Dockerized so that they can be run as a Docker container, and the kubelet is one of them. So what Kind have done is they've taken this to the next level, and Kind basically bootstraps a kubelet within a Docker container and then runs all the dependencies inside of that container. So instead of running a Hyper-V with a virtual machine, you can just run a Docker container as a node and have a Kubernetes cluster up and running in seconds. And we all know Docker is really quick to start up. It's much faster than a virtual machine. So this already is kind of attractive because we can start up Kubernetes clusters about as quickly as we can start Docker containers. So the way I'd like to install this is get over to the GitHub repo in the top right corner. And what we want to do is go over to the releases page, expand the assets, and you'll see there's a Windows binary as well as a Linux binary. So what I did is I just download this guy. So while that's downloading, what we're going to want to do is go ahead and set up an environment variable. So we go to environment variables, and I normally set it up for system wide. There's a path. You want to expand that. And I already have one for kubectl. Now you can either create a new one here for Kind, or we can go ahead to that kubectl folder and drop that exe that we've just downloaded into here. Now you're going to want to rename it from kind Windows AMD64 to kind.exe and just drop it into that folder. So by having that, we can now open up a PowerShell window and we can start running the kind command. So I can just say kind. And we can already see that this is very simple. There's kind create. This is the command we're going to be interested in. And then there's kind delete. So once we're done, we can dispose of the cluster. So let's take a look at this. Kind create cluster. And what you can do is you can pass in a specific image you want to use. So you can point it to different versions of Kubernetes. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to say create cluster. I'm going to give it a name, prod1. So I'm going to spin up a production cluster. So we're going to go ahead and wait for this to complete. And there we go, it's done. So it went and created a Kubernetes cluster using 1.15.3. So you can specify the version of the cluster you want by passing in the image. You can see preparing nodes. It's created a control plane. And then it gives you a bunch of options to access the cluster. Now for PowerShell, you can set an environment variable, or you just on Bash, you just set a kubeconfig environment variable like that. So what we're going to go ahead and do before we do this, I'm going to spin up another cluster and show you how you can create multiple clusters. So let's say we spin up another one called prod2, and by doing this you can spin up like a dev, staging, production, and you can try out like CI/CD pipelines and things like that as well. So I want to show you how quickly it is to spin up multiple Kubernetes environments. And now that that is done, let's set a PowerShell variable for our kubeconfig. The kubeconfig file looks at a kubeconfig variable. So at the moment, if I run kubectl get nodes, I'm pointing to my Docker desktop, the default Kubernetes cluster on Windows. So I want to actually point to my kind cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and set that. Now, what you can also do is if you have multiple clusters, you can go ahead and set that one, but now you'll only be able to see that cluster. What we can do to point to multiple Kubernetes clusters, we can go ahead and merge this. So this command here will tell us where that config file is. So you can see it's created a kubeconfig for prod2 in that location. So what we want to go ahead and do is we want to merge a bunch of configs together. So I'm going to copy that, and then I am going to create a semicolon like that. So you can see if you semicolon delimit these parts, you can add multiple Kubernetes clusters to your kubeconfig file. And then what we can say is kubectl config get contexts, and we can see now where we have prod 1 and 2. So this allows us to work on multiple Kubernetes clusters. And if we say docker ps, we can see we have our Kubernetes clusters running as Docker containers. It's going to be like a test. And my use case is basically I want to test out my monitoring to make sure my new monitoring system works. So now that that is done, we can see I have Grafana running. I've got a metrics server to expose cluster metrics. I have node exporter that exposes all the telemetry of the node itself. So basically the kind cluster node. I also have Prometheus operator, which manages Prometheus. So then what we can also do is we can go ahead and port forward to the Grafana node. So I'll just go there on port 3000. And we can head over to Grafana. I'll just go admin because that's the default login, and for this purpose I'll just say admin, and we have a cluster up and running. I have a data source, Prometheus. We can test it, it's working. What else do we have? Bunch of dashboards. This is the most useful one I find. Node exporter is really helpful, shows all the nodes in the cluster. Start pulling all the telemetry like CPU, memory, and everything that happens on this machine. Very nice. Also see pod metrics start coming through. I can select my namespace. I can select the different pods. And we can start seeing that the telemetry should start populating. Yeah, so this kind of shows you how easy it is to play around with Kubernetes using Kind. I can then say Kind delete cluster and I can also delete prod2. So that's a really cool technology for spinning up Kubernetes clusters and doing a lot of use case style testing. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope that utility is useful for you. Let me know down in the comments what sort of videos you'd like me to cover in the future. And until next time, peace. On the face like I'm